I'm Paul, and today we're going to talk about vintage speakers and how to deal with them. And our question comes thanks to Brian in Tucson, Arizona. God, I always want to say the C in Tucson, Arizona, but it's Tucson. Paul, my name is Brian, and I own a pair of vintage Infinity Crescendo CS 309s. 3009s? Never heard. I didn't even know Infinity made a product called Crescendos. He'd like to refurbish the innards with new polyfill. And now polyfill is the damping material that speaker manufacturers put inside to kind of damp the inside of the cabinet. Are there new things audiophile experts have learned since the 90s that I could do to make these sound better with new materials, or should I leave them like Infinity made them? And what was the original design of the cabinets and damping materials? Well, that's a question I get asked a lot because, as most of you know, in Music Room 1, I've got a pair of vintage loudspeakers. They are one of 58 pair ever made. They're called the Infinity IRS 5s, and they were made in 1985. And I had to replace many of the drivers in there. I had to reconfigure the crossovers because the parts in there had gone bad. So there are things you have to do if you take on vintage loudspeakers. I would say probably one of the most common problems that we find in vintage loudspeakers are the surrounds of woofers. So if you look at a typical woofer, let's say you've got a 12-inch, 10-inch, 8-inch, there is a cone made out of metal, paper, plastic, any number of things that form the piston that moves in and out to pressurize the air and we hear sound. You can't have that thing flopping around. So around the outside of the cone is material that's very flexible called a surround. And that surround is usually, well, in the old days, they were made of like butyl rubber. And well, I'm not a driver expert, but there were any number of flexible materials that were in use. And I remember maybe the 1980s, a number of companies had made the mistake of switching over to a material for their surrounds. And I don't remember what it was, but it was a disaster because what happened was, while it worked great here in the States, when those went overseas, especially to very humid countries like in Asia or anywhere along the equator, the surrounds got some kind of mold in them, and they were eaten. And within months, those things just disintegrated. It was a real disaster, and most of those speakers were covered under warranty. So the big, JBL, Infinity, and those big companies, they went through hell and back with that, but they finally came up with surround materials that weren't affected by this. And in any case, the age is something that will turn those very flexible surrounds brittle, and they disintegrate, and then you're left with an inoperative woofer. So a number of services do reconing and resurrounds. My Infinity IRS 5s, I had to take those and have each of the woofers added new surrounds. I kept the same cone material, but I got all new surrounds. So that's one of the most common things you see. Tweeters generally last forever, for a good long time, unless one of the little inquisitive hands don't poke in the dome or something. But inside, the damping material pretty much, unless it has degraded, they used to use wool. For a long time, there was like lamb's wool and products that were made from animals that, when you opened it up, had disintegrated or had gotten moisture in there. And so you would want to check those. And those are some of the earliest designs. But in more modern designs of companies, for instance, Infinity, that started in the late 60s, early 70s, they were all using Dacron and synthetic materials for their fill. And I don't think that ever degrades. It certainly hasn't in my experience, although I always have a silly story. When I was, Arnie Nudell and I were running Genesis, we made a set of speakers that we had just introduced. I don't remember which ones they were. It doesn't matter. But we always had subwoofers inside of these because we are big believers in built-in subs, right? So in the back of the speaker, we put a Class D amplifier. I think it was a Class D. Pretty sure it was. And the plate amp that went in the back did a great job of driving the subwoofer. There was only one problem. The components in there, some individual coils and things, got really hot. And when we stuffed the Dacron material into the woofer cabinet, we weren't careful and we didn't put a little bit of a shield over there. And so some of that material on, 20 or 30 units that got out the door before we found us, they didn't light on fire, but they certainly got on and melted all over the components and killed the amplifiers. And we started having a rash of these amps, like dead and burning smell, and we found out what we'd done. It was easy to fix, but it's just one of those crazy things. I don't know why that even came up. But anyway, so I wouldn't bother changing that. And if you're of a mind to change the amount, if it was by a speaker company like Infinity, who really cared about the way their products sounded, be very careful. Those were usually done by measuring the amount so that it was exact, and the way it was fluffed and all that, that will have an impact on how the speaker sounds. So I would leave those things alone. I would make sure my woofers and their surrounds are intact, and if not, I would get those replaced. But most important, look at the crossover. The crossover is where you're going to find parts that will need to be replaced or could be improved. Here you can use a better quality of cap. Keep the same value. That's important because those crossovers are designed to work with those values. But I would replace the capacitors and just use the best that you can afford, making sure the values stay the same. And resistors generally don't die, so I wouldn't worry about that. I would change the caps, make sure the surrounds are okay, and then I think you're going to be in good shape. That was a good question. Thank you so much.